A newborn gasps its first breath, not in a sterile hospital, but beneath a canopy of ancient pines. The night air bites cold. There is no name, no crib, no lullaby, only the warmth of a mother's chest and the faint flicker of firelight as wolves howl in the distance. This child has entered a world where nothing is guaranteed. Not safety, not food, not even tomorrow. It is the Upper Paleolithic, and to be born is not to begin a life, but to start surviving. For most of human history, tens of thousands of years, childhood looked nothing like it does today. There were no toys, no schools, no parents who knew what they were doing. There was only the clan and the wild. But here's what might surprise you. Childhood did exist, even then, and it mattered. Anthropologists today are uncovering evidence from cave burials, fossilized footprints, and ancient encampments that children played, learned, and even changed the course of our species. At the heart of this is a mystery. How did children survive, and why were they so crucial to human evolution? There is no midwife, no medical kit. A mother squats near a fire, clutching the bark of a tree. Her face is stone, her groans are low and rhythmic. Around her, other women kneel in silence, ready to help or to bury. Childbirth in the Stone Age was deadly, for both mother and child. Estimates suggest that up to 30% of women died giving birth during the Paleolithic. Many children didn't survive the first year. Infection, cold, starvation. A simple breech birth could be fatal. If a child lived past 5 winters, that alone was a triumph. And yet, even here, in the blood and frost of prehistory, there is tenderness. In the Shanidar cave of Iraq, a 10-year-old Neanderthal child was buried in a bed of wildflowers. Pollen grains still cling to the soil where his tiny skull was found. Someone, perhaps his mother, perhaps his tribe, gave him a burial rich with meaning. With love. He was a child who never saw adulthood. But still, they grieved him. If stories like this stir something ancient in you, something raw and human, subscribe. This is only the beginning. Childhood wasn't just a vulnerable phase. It was a training ground. Studies of modern hunter-gatherers, like the Hadza of Tanzania or the Ache of Paraguay, show that even young children begin learning critical survival skills by watching, mimicking, and playing. Throwing sticks becomes spear practice. Splashing in the river becomes fishing. By age 3 or 4, Stone Age children were already learning how to identify edible plants, track animals, and sense danger. Not from school books, but from watching death up close. Archaeological sites like Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic reveal child-made artifacts. Tiny clay figurines, miniature tools, some so small they could only be toys or training pieces. This suggests that Stone Age childhood had structure, not institutional, but cultural, rituals, imitation, and practice. A child wasn't just a mouth to feed. They were a future hunter, healer, or leader in the making. To be born into the Stone Age was to enter a lottery where the stakes were life and extinction, but it was also to join the oldest school on Earth, the school of survival, and for those who made it through the first few brutal years. Something else waited. Adulthood would come soon. But first came the games of survival. Children chase each other through tall grass, shrieking not with fear, but laughter. One brandishes a stick like a spear. Another crouches behind a log, mimicking the stealth of a stalking predator. Their mothers watch from a distance, not smiling indulgently, but alert. This is not recess. This is rehearsal. In the Stone Age, play was not a luxury. It was a survival strategy, and every game was a lesson written in dirt, danger, and instinct. At first glance, It's tempting to imagine prehistoric children as miniature adults, working, hunting, and gathering from the moment they could walk. But archaeology tells a richer story. From Siberia to Spain, traces of children's play have been uncovered. Miniature bows, carved dolls, and tools too small for adult hands. In the famous site of Medzhyrich in Ukraine, 15,000-year-old mammoth bone huts contain marks that appear to be the scribbles of idle children, not hunters. More than that, the patterns of foot traffic at some dig sites, like the 20,000-year-old footprints of children dancing in soft cave mud in France's Chauvet Cave, suggest moments of joy, spontaneity, and imagination. And what were they playing? Most likely, games of hunting, tracking, and hiding. Games that mimic fear to master it. For a child in the Ice Age, a stick could become many things: a weapon, a fishing pole, a digging tool, or a symbol of power. Ethnographic parallels from groups like the !Kung of the Kalahari, or the Inuit of the Arctic, show that children invent games around real-life danger. They stalk each other through the bush. They act out the death of prey. They play leopard, taking turns being the hunter and the hunted. And there's a dark edge to this play. Children learned to pretend kill, not because it was fun, but because they would someday need to do it for real. Not in years, in seasons. Among the Ache, boys often join their first hunts by age 10. Among prehistoric peoples, that timeline may have been even faster, especially in lean years, when survival could not wait for puberty. And then there are the figurines. At sites like Dolny Vestonice, small clay figures, some of them grotesque, others beautiful, have been found near hearths and animal bones. Were they toys? Fertility idols? Teaching tools? We may never know. But we do know children were there. Their fingerprints, small, unmistakable, are pressed into the soft clay of those ancient objects. They left no writing, but they left their touch. Modern evolutionary psychology offers a powerful insight. Play is practice, especially in dangerous environments. Children who played more were better prepared, not just physically, but socially. Through games, they learned hierarchy, negotiation, and cooperation. They learned who was brave and who might be a liability. In many ways, these games were a primitive form of leadership selection. A child who showed boldness in a mock hunt might one day lead a real one. A girl who mimicked healing rituals might become the tribe's shaman. These were not random fantasies. They were rehearsals for roles the tribe needed filled. A boy crouches beneath a fallen tree, breathing silently, fingers dug into damp moss. Somewhere behind him, another child moves through the woods, calling softly. The rules are simple. Don't get caught, but the stakes are deeper. Learning to vanish into the forest is not a game. It's how you escape predators. It's how you ambush prey. It's how you live. And yet, there is laughter. Even at the edge of survival, children laughed, because laughter too is human. And the children of the Stone Age, for all their scars and hunger, were still children. Some of those children never made it to adulthood. Their toys are buried in midden heaps. Their bones sometimes appear beside animal remains, hard to distinguish. But their play echoed across generations. What they learned in the dirt, their children would pass on, and then their children's children, until eventually. So they fought to become ancestors. If you're still here, you carry their victory. Subscribe for the rest of their story. We haven't even reached the hardest part. Soon the games would end. A girl would stop pretending to gather berries and start doing it for real. A boy would stop playing with a spear and take his first life. And sometimes, not in animals, because childhood didn't last long, and what came next would demand everything. In the next part, death, grief, and what children learned from it. The first time they saw death. A child stands still. Before her, the body of a young man, her cousin perhaps, lies face down in the blood-streaked snow. An aurochs, massive and enraged, had gored him during the hunt. The child's breath fogs in the cold. She does not cry. Not yet. This is the moment no game prepared her for. And yet, it was always coming. In the Stone Age, children met death not through bedtime stories, but face to face. Not once. Not as metaphor. But over and over again, raw, visible, permanent. In prehistoric life, death was not hidden. It was a part of the landscape. Children witnessed it early. In animals killed for food, in accidents, in conflict. They saw corpses, smelled decay, helped with burials. There were no walls to protect them from grief. There was no concept of too young to understand. Anthropological studies of modern hunter-gatherer societies support this. Among the AKA of Central Africa and the exclamation mark Kung of the Kalahari, children are present at deaths, and they participate in mourning. They're not shielded, they're included. Why? Because understanding death was essential, emotionally, practically, spiritually. In a small cave in Gravettian Europe, archaeologists found the remains of a young boy, maybe 9 or 10 years old, buried with pierced shell beads, fox teeth, and red ochre. Next to him, a child, even younger, possibly his brother. The grave was careful, symbolic. Someone had wept. Someone had said goodbye. And the survivors, maybe a little sister watching nearby, carried that ritual forward. They learned in that moment what death meant. A parting, yes, but also, strangely, a promise, a connection to ancestors, a reason to remember. Death for prehistoric children was not just trauma, it was instruction. They learned how to mourn, but also how to not die. They remembered the fall that shattered a hunter's leg, the mistake that drew a predator, the illness that stole a sibling in the night. These weren't statistics, they were stories told in bone and blood. And from these stories, children shaped their instincts, their fears, their faiths. But not all death was mourned. In some Paleolithic sites, the bones of infants and small children are found in trash pits, discarded with animal remains. No burial, no beads, no ochre. Why? Some deaths, especially in times of famine, may have been too common or too hard to grieve. In harsh environments, emotional detachment was a form of survival. You couldn't weep for every child lost. Sometimes they were simply forgotten. And this, too, children learned. That not all lives were sacred. That love could be a liability. That survival had a price. Modern neuroscience shows that early exposure to grief can rewire the brain, altering fear responses, emotional regulation, and attachment behaviors. Among ancient humans, this may have created children who were more cautious, more resilient, or more detached. In short, they grew up faster, because they had to. This didn't make them heartless, but it made their emotional world different from ours, more raw, more immediate, more earned. In Sangir, Russia, 2 Paleolithic children, a boy and a girl, were buried head-to-head in a grave of extraordinary richness. Over 10,000 ivory beads, a polished mammoth femur, and spears carved from long bones. Their death, whatever the cause, must have shaken their people. Such a sacrifice of resources was staggering. What did the surviving children think as they watched? Perhaps those 2 mattered more than most. Perhaps that's what it means to be honored. Perhaps if I die, will they bury me like that? The first time a child saw death, it carved something into them. Not just fear, but meaning. It taught them who was remembered, who was left behind, and what it took to be mourned. That awareness shaped how they lived. Because in the Stone Age, You weren't just trying to survive the next hunt or the next winter. You were trying, silently, instinctively, to matter enough to be remembered. And some of them did. We know their names, not in language, but in bones and burial. By now, the child is no longer innocent. She knows what blood smells like, what death looks like. And soon she will face something even more dangerous than predators or disease. The rules of the tribe, the limits of belonging, and the price of disobedience. A sharp cry breaks the silence, not of pain, but of shame. A boy stumbles back into the circle of firelight, his eyes wide with humiliation. He had touched the meat before the elders, taken what wasn't his, a taboo. The punishment isn't violent, but it is brutal. No one looks at him. No one speaks. He is invisible. And in that silence, he breaks. In the Stone Age, exile wasn't just a sentence. It was a death sentence. And children learned early. The worst thing you could be wasn't weak. It was unworthy. Children in prehistoric tribes didn't face detention or grounding. Their consequences were primal. Isolation, scorn, exclusion. Why? Because survival depended on the group. A single child could not live alone. Trust, obedience, and cohesion were everything. And the tribe had to teach this early, or perish. From ethnographic analogues like the Inuit, Hadza, and Ju Hoansi, we know that children learned rules through social correction, not physical violence, but psychological weight. Shame, mimicry, teasing, sometimes public rituals of mockery. You took too much? They made you sit alone during the next meal. You lied? They laughed at you in song, turning your mistake into a chorus, and everyone sang. Among the exclamation marks Kung San of the Kalahari, children are gently mocked when they boast or break taboos. A boy who lies about hunting success might find the whole camp telling exaggerated versions of his tale, until he sees the absurdity and joins in the laughter. This wasn't cruelty, it was calibration. In a world without written laws, enforcement came from the gaze of others, and from stories. Children learned not only what not to do, but how to feel about it. Guilt, embarrassment, self-regulation. At first glance, it seems small. A prank, a nickname, a laugh. But those moments forged a mind that knew its place in the group. Too far outside the tribe, and you risked becoming prey. Too far inside, and you might challenge the elders. And that was dangerous too. So children learned balance, humility, timing. In many ways, these early moral lessons were the origin of conscience itself. But what if the child didn't learn? Some archaeological sites suggest that not all young were fully integrated into the social unit. Skeletons of adolescents found alone, without grave goods, buried outside the group. Were they outcasts, cursed, punished? In some modern hunter-gatherer societies, difficult children, those who steal, lie, or disobey repeatedly, may face abandonment or exclusion, not through violence, through neglect, because a threat to the group's harmony was a threat to survival, even if that threat came from a child. Evolutionary psychologists argue that shame and guilt developed as adaptations, not to make us good, but to make us trusted. Children who could learn remorse were more likely to be accepted, protected, fed. Those who couldn't were cast out. So the moral sense, that prick of shame, that twinge of guilt, began not in religion or civilization, but in the clan's cold silence. It wasn't about right or wrong. It was about belonging. A girl walks among her tribe. She has lied twice, once about meat, once about blame. Her peers avoid her eyes. The adults call others to the fire before her. Even her mother hesitates. She is not beaten. She is erased. And for a child whose identity is still forming, there may be no pain greater. But if she shows remorse, if she helps without asking, gives without needing, apologizes not in words, but in gesture. She may return. The tribe doesn't want to lose her, but they need her to learn. In the Ice Age, there were no commandments carved in stone, no sacred texts, but there were rules, etched into behavior, enforced through emotion. And children weren't just taught to obey them, they were taught to feel them. Their moral compass wasn't philosophical, it was visceral. To steal was not a crime, it was a scar on the self. To disobey was not rebellion, it was stepping outside the firelight, into the jaws of night. By now the child understands danger, not just the kind that hunts, but the kind that whispers. But there's one lesson left to learn, the one even the elders fear: how to kill. The spear trembles in his hands. He is no longer a boy, but he is not yet a man. Ahead of him, the animal stumbles, a red bloom spreading behind its shoulder. The boy hears nothing, not the shouts of the hunters, not the crunch of snow, only his own breath. Then the beast collapses, and just like that, he has taken a life. This is the moment that splits a child's world in two, before the kill and after it. In the world of prehistory, killing was not an act of rage. It was a rite of necessity, and often a rite of passage. Children didn't kill for power. They killed to eat, to defend, to prove they could. Because until they did, they remained a liability. From the San Bushman to the Inuit, ethnographic accounts show children as young as 8 or 9 joining hunts. Not always as active killers, but as participants. By adolescence, they were expected to take their first animal. This was not optional, it was identity. To be a man, or in some cases a woman hunter, meant bearing the weight of death. Archaeologists at Panga ya Saidi in Kenya uncovered tools so small, so finely worked, they could only have been used by children, likely in training. These weren't toys, they were the first lessons in lethality. Imagine a 12-year-old girl gutting a rabbit with practiced hands, a 10-year-old boy learning how to make a trap that ends a life quietly, without glory. These were not exceptions, they were expectations. And when the first kill came, whether with a spear, snare, or club, the child changed. There was blood, always blood. And though the tribe praised, cheered even, something quieter settled into the child's chest. Not shame, not fear, but heaviness. Modern psychology tells us that first encounters with death, especially when caused by one's own actions, can imprint deeply, sometimes with pride, sometimes with trauma. In the Stone Age, there was no therapy, no processing. There was only the fire, and silence, and memory, and sometimes ritual. Among the Ainu of Japan, young boys were initiated into manhood with their first bear kill, followed by ritual apologies to the animal's spirit. The Hadza of Tanzania sometimes anoint first-time hunters with the blood of their prey, marking the transition. These practices suggest something profound. Even in prehistory, humans knew that taking a life wasn't just physical, it was spiritual. Children were taught not just to kill, but to respect the kill, to ask forgiveness, to remember the moment, because one day they too would die, and perhaps be remembered. But sometimes, the first kill wasn't an animal. Raids, tribal warfare, and revenge killings were part of prehistoric life, especially during times of migration or scarcity. We can't know the exact age of prehistoric warriors, but skeletal trauma on adolescents at sites like Jebel Sahaba in Sudan suggests that some combatants were barely into puberty. A child with a blade, a child with rage, or worse, a child with orders. We don't know what it did to them, but we know what it did to us, because these were our ancestors, and their first kills became our inheritance, written not in blood, but in fear, in myth, in memory. Neuroscience shows that acts of violence, especially repeated ones, can reshape empathy, impulse control, and even perception of threat. Among early humans, this might have served a brutal function, creating efficient killers. But it also created something else: myth makers. To live with killing, children had to make meaning of it. Stories, spirits, curses. Maybe that's where the first ghost stories came from. Because guilt, unspoken, demands an explanation. The child returns from the hunt. He is praised, fed first, given the choicest piece of liver. He smiles. But that night, he dreams of the animal's eyes. In the Paleolithic world, survival required hardness. But children were not born hard. They were made. And their first kill was the chisel. The spear has landed. The blood has cooled. Now the child is no longer a child. But there's one more challenge, stranger than death, and older than war: faith. Not belief in gods, but in shadows, in dreams, in spirits that may or may not speak back. The child awakes in darkness. She is cold, alone, but not afraid, not quite. In her dream, a stag with burning eyes spoke her name. In its breath, fire. In its eyes, sorrow. She tells no one. But the old woman in the corner hut watches her differently now. Because in the Stone Age, dreams weren't dreams. They were messages. And sometimes, children were the first to hear them. Before gods had names, before temples were raised, before the written word carved belief into stone. There were stories whispered in firelight, and visions born in sleep. And children were often the first to speak them. In prehistoric cultures, the boundary between waking life and dream was porous. Spirits walked the land. Animals had souls. The dead watched. And dreams were not fantasy. They were instruction. From Upper Paleolithic caves in France to Ice Age camps in Siberia, we find evidence of symbolic behavior. Ochre-painted walls, ritual burials, animal-human hybrids carved from mammoth ivory. These were not decorations. They were beliefs, and belief had to be learned. In many modern hunter-gatherer cultures, such as the Sami of northern Scandinavia, the Yanomami of South America, or the Evenki of Siberia, the role of shaman often began in childhood. Not chosen by lineage, chosen by visions. Children who dreamed strange dreams, who talked to unseen things, who saw patterns others missed. These were watched closely. If their dreams continued, they were taken under the wing of the tribe's spiritual elder, taught to enter trance, to sing to the ancestors, to journey through pain and ecstasy. Some were praised, others feared, but all were changed. Imagine a child by the fire, telling of a dream where the moon turned red and a bear walked on two legs. The tribe listens, not because it's charming, but because it might be a warning. These were not bedtime stories. They were survival codes, mythos, memory, clues passed down as tales. The child may not understand what they mean, but the elders do, and the tale is remembered. Some Paleolithic cave paintings suggest trance-like states, not just depictions of the world, but the underworld of the mind. In Chauvet Cave, among the oldest cave art known, there are hundreds of animals, but also abstract symbols, hallucination-like forms. These may reflect altered states, dream logic made visible, and some handprints are small, child-sized, which means some of the earliest artists, the first myth makers, were children. They didn't just believe in spirits. They talked to them, painted them, sang to them in silence. And somewhere in that sacred darkness, belief began. Developmental psychology tells us that children are naturally inclined toward magical thinking, a stage when the boundaries between imagination, cause-effect, and fantasy blur. In the prehistoric world, this wasn't seen as naivety, it was a gift. Children's brains, rich in neuroplasticity, vivid in perception, may have been the perfect vessels for spiritual sensitivity. And for tribes that lived on intuition, sign, and ritual, those gifts mattered. A child's dream might mean the herd was coming. A shadow might mean the ancestors were near. And to ignore those signs was to risk everything. Among the Evenki shamans, it's said that some children begin speaking unknown tongues during fever dreams. Others wake screaming the names of dead relatives. In one tribe, a child who drew animals bleeding from the eyes was taken to the shaman, not punished, but studied. What did they see? What do all children still see? In the darkness before reason, before fact, before dogma, there is only wonder. And wonder, in the Stone Age, was sacred. This was the true power of prehistoric childhood. They were not yet fixed in the world. They could straddle it, foot in the visible, foot in the imagined. And for a people trying to understand death, seasons, stars, hunger, and hope, those imaginations became anchors. The child's dream became the tribe's truth. But visions alone could not feed the clan. Stories could not fend off winter. The child who once played, who now dreams, must soon learn work, to gather, to carry, to bleed for the tribe, not in battle, but in burden. The sun hasn't risen. The air is thick with fog, and frost clings to the edges of woven grass baskets. A child's hands, raw, blistered, calloused, grip a stone scraper, flensing sinew from hide. She is no older than 10. There are no more games, no more lessons. Childhood is over, and she will not have another. In the modern world, childhood is a protected phase, a span of years for growth, exploration, and learning. But in the Paleolithic world, it was brief, and sometimes it vanished altogether. Work began as soon as the body could endure it. Among modern hunter-gatherers, children begin contributing to subsistence between the ages of 5 and 7. They gather, clean, tend fires, fetch water, scare off animals. By 10 or 12, their productivity may equal that of adults. Prehistoric children likely followed this same arc, not out of cruelty, but necessity. In a world where every calorie mattered, no hands could be idle. In the forests of Ice Age Europe, a boy no taller than his spear carries a bundle of firewood twice his weight. He stumbles, falls, rises again, not because he's eager, but because if he fails, the fire dies. And without fire, so do they. Anthropological studies show that among the AKA people, children carry babies, process food, and repair shelters by age 8. It is not seen as exceptional. It is seen as life. So it must have been for our ancestors. Work was not a punishment. It was participation. And participation was belonging. The division of labor came early. Girls often joined their mothers, gathering, processing food, weaving, healing. Boys learned from hunters, craftsmen, scouts. But this was not rigid. In some sites, such as Dolny Vestonets, female burials contain hunting tools, and male burials contain jewelry-making kits. In the prehistoric world, survival dictated flexibility. If a girl was strong, she hunted. If a boy had a healer's hands, he tended wounds. But most children learned early that their tasks weren't just chores. They were identities in the making. This transition, from play to labor, could be swift, especially in crisis. In drought, famine, or migration, even the youngest were pressed into service. Grinding seeds, hauling water, carrying infants across miles. Archaeological evidence from Middle Stone Age sites shows growth interruptions in the bones of children, likely from overwork, malnutrition, and stress. One child's skeleton from Kafza Cave showed signs of healed trauma, not from violence, but from exhaustion. Even when they lived, they bore the marks of labor, and the marks were permanent. Modern studies on child labor show higher rates of stunted growth, chronic pain, and emotional desensitization. In the Paleolithic, there were no protections, but there was also pride. A child who carried her weight earned praise. A child who contributed earned trust. There may have been no concept of self-esteem, but there was worth, and children knew it. She has struck fire before dawn 3 days in a row. Her fingers are cut. Her palms are burned. But her mother watches her with respect. She is no longer seen as a child. She is a provider. She may still sleep in the children's shelter. But her soul is already older. In the prehistoric world, childhood did not end with celebration. It ended with responsibility. There were no birthdays, no rites of passage, not until later. The moment a child's effort began to matter more than their innocence. They were no longer a child, and most never looked back. To carry, to bleed, to scrape, to sew. These were not chores. They were the first steps toward being remembered. The child has learned the weight of labor, but the body still aches, the fire still flickers, and soon the clan will move. The child must now learn to leave behind the familiar, to adapt, to face exile and the unknown. The world is moving beneath their feet. Ice sheets creep southward. The rains have stopped. The game has vanished. The tribe gathers what little they have and begins to walk. A girl, no more than 9, carries a baby on her back and a pouch of dried roots at her side. Her feet are blistered, her eyes forward. She does not ask when they will stop, because in the Ice Age, the journey was never over. To live, they had to move. Migration was not an event. It was a condition of life. Whether in response to climate shifts, herd movement, resource depletion, or conflict, prehistoric humans moved, often and far. Entire tribes packed up shelters, tools, and children, trekking across hundreds of kilometers without certainty of return. And children weren't carried. They walked. Footprints in places like White Sands, New Mexico, show trails of entire groups, adults, adolescents, toddlers, traversing mudflats together. One young girl's prints stretch for nearly a mile. Carrying a baby. She stumbled. She got up and kept walking. A group climbs a glacial pass. The wind bites. The path narrows. A child lags behind, not from laziness, but from frostbite. An elder carries her for a while, then sets her down. They move again. In these moments, no one waits long. The group cannot afford to. Every migration was a race against time, against winter, thirst, or an enemy tribe. And children learned step by step that movement was survival. Migration also meant loss. Not every camp could be returned to. Not every body could be buried. Sometimes children left behind siblings, friends, even memories, swallowed by the landscape. At archaeological sites like Sungir in Russia and La Ferracie in France, multiple child burials show signs of abandonment or abrupt departure. Hasty graves, scattered bones, fires not fully extinguished. These weren't rituals, they were evacuations, and the children who survived carried those absences in silence. Not all children could keep up. Skeletal remains in high-altitude passes, like those in the Alps and Caucasus, include children aged 4 to 10. Some show no trauma, only exposure. They didn't die in battle. They died in the in-between. And sometimes the tribe had no choice but to keep walking. For the survivors, this was the hardest lesson. The path didn't stop for grief. Modern studies show that children in subsistence societies develop exceptional endurance, both physical and psychological, far beyond those in industrialized cultures. The caloric burn of migration was immense, yet children adapted quickly, learning to regulate pace, conserve energy, and manage pain. More than adults, they absorbed changes in landscape, weather, animal behavior. They became navigators. In fact, some indigenous traditions held that children were better pathfinders, unburdened by overthinking. In the Ice Age, this trait was not myth. It was survival instinct. The tribe is lost. A storm has erased their tracks. But the boy, who had played near a forked tree 2 moons ago, remembers a ridge, a bend, a sound. They follow him. By dusk, they find shelter. He is 9 years old, and they will never doubt him again. There were no milestones, no ages marked, only distances survived. For many prehistoric children, movement was the defining feature of their youth. They learned in motion, grieved in motion, grew in motion, and somewhere between leaving and arriving. They became something more than just children. But not every step led to new hope. Some migrations ended in hunger, isolation, or discovery of enemies. Now the child would face what the tribe feared most, not nature, but others. They smell, smoke, not their own fire, not their own meat. The boy freezes. He gestures to his mother, hand to chest, then to mouth. Strangers. No one speaks. Beyond the ridge, another clan is camped. Spears lie beside sleeping bodies. The air hums with tension. The child does not understand the words they speak, but he knows the truth behind them. They are not us. In prehistory, meeting another group could mean alliance or annihilation. Territory was everything. Resources were scarce. Miscommunication could spark violence, but so could curiosity. And children, unburdened by leadership or pride, were often the first to cross that invisible line. At sites like Kostenki and Gunnersdorf, symbolic items, beads, shells, tools, show evidence of trade and shared cultural motifs. These weren't just goods, they were introductions, and the most neutral carriers of those offerings? Often the young. 2 groups camp within sight. The elders posture, watching. The hunters circle warily. But 2 children, one from each clan, approach with gifts. A carved wolf figurine, a feather, a laugh. They don't speak the same language, but they mimic. They share berries. They draw in the dirt. By nightfall, the adults are talking, not fighting. It was the children who began it, but not every meeting ended with sharing. Sites like Jebel Sahaba and Nataruk show the aftermath of prehistoric conflict. Entire groups killed, including women and children. Arrows embedded in spines, skulls crushed, lives ended in panic or vengeance. Sometimes strangers were not potential friends. They were warnings, and children learned to watch for signs, posture, tone, silence. They became readers of human intent long before speech could clarify. One possibility that haunts the archaeological record: abduction. Children, light, impressionable, trainable, may have been taken in raids, raised by rivals, made symbols of dominance or tokens of peace. We can't know their names, but in bones found far from any familiar genetic match, in burials alongside foreign goods, hints emerge. A girl buried with a different people. A boy whose tooth enamel says he was born in one region, but died hundreds of miles away. They may not have run. They may not have wanted to, but they never went back. Children are linguistic sponges. In modern cross-cultural studies, children exposed to multiple languages early can adapt fluidly, often bridging gaps that adults cannot. In the prehistoric world, this meant they were the translators, the adapters, the future. First contact wasn't just physical, it was conceptual, and children were often the ones who imagined new ways to connect. Sometimes this meant peace. Sometimes something stranger. A child hears a story from the other tribe of a bear who became a man, who walked into the sky and became a star. She smiles. They tell a similar tale. By morning, both groups sing versions of it by the fire. A new myth is born, because when children met strangers, they didn't just trade berries or beads, they traded world views. And sometimes, those stories lived longer than either tribe. The child has now seen what her parents feared, and what they never imagined. She knows that not all who look different mean harm. But she also knows that trust is survival's riskiest gamble. To meet a stranger is to gamble with the future. But without that risk, there is no change, no progress, no us. Now the child is almost grown. She has killed, she has worked, she has mourned, moved, dreamed, and met others. And now, she faces the last question. What will she leave behind? Beneath layers of soil and time, they wait. Tiny bones, worn teeth, fingerprints pressed into clay, footprints locked in volcanic ash. No names, no monuments, no songs. And yet, they changed everything. They were children. They lived. They suffered. They imagined. And they gave us the world. When we think of prehistory, we picture the hunter, the fire starter, the elder. But for every spear thrown, there was a child watching, mimicking, learning, improving. They were not passive. They were pivotal. In the margins of Ice Age camps, children shaped stone tools. In burial sites, their decorations reveal ritual and meaning. In caves, their handprints show us who entered the darkness first. They were the first apprentices, the first students, the first ones to ask why, and in that question began humanity's ascent. Among the bones of animals and the scars of warfare, we find traces of something else: playthings, doodles, miniature tools, figurines with exaggerated features, perhaps early forms of humor or parody. These were not just cultural fragments, they were emotional footprints, because the capacity to laugh, to pretend, to deceive, all emerged through childhood. It was in children that culture first rehearsed itself. Prehistoric children did not sit in classrooms. They learned through doing, through fire, through danger, through imitation and error. Cognitive scientists now argue that the human brain evolved not simply through adult innovation, but through the way children learned to build on it. Each generation started over, but never from zero. The story of human progress is the story of young minds outpacing old ones. And yet, we forget them. Their lives are rarely named in history. Their graves are small. Their stories, when told, are often softened, as if the past was too hard for the young to endure. But they did endure. They endured the cold, the hunger, the fear. And they dreamed anyway. In their footprints, we find resilience. In their tiny tools, ingenuity. In their songs and whispers and tears, the raw materials of civilization. There's a deeper truth, hidden in the body. Stress leaves marks not just in bones, but in genes. Trauma, hunger, overwork, all may have altered epigenetic markers passed on to future generations. In this way, the suffering of prehistoric children may still echo in us. How we learn, what we fear, what comforts us. It's possible that much of this was shaped by what they endured. They are not just stories, they are part of us. At Sungir, 2 children were laid to rest in a grave of unmatched care, dressed in thousands of ivory beads, armed with weapons they would never wield, cradled in mammoth bone. Whoever they were, they mattered. Their tribe believed in something enough to give them beauty after death. And today, thousands of years later, we remember them still. We are the children of survivors, not just hunters, not just thinkers, but of children who played, who worked, who mourned, who wandered. They left us no books, no maps, only questions and clues. But through them, we learn to ask those questions. We learn to imagine the answers. The legacy of prehistoric childhood is not buried in the ground. It is alive in every curiosity, every dream, every instinct to belong. They were not lost. They became us. You've stayed this far. Maybe because some part of you remembers what it meant to run barefoot through wild grass, to fear the night, to carry more than your age could bear. Subscribe, not just to hear their stories, but to remember that they are still inside you, because the oldest memory in the world might be your own.